Let's face it, the Bible is a violent book, the cross is a violent place, and our kids know it. We may avoid the issue, tiptoeing around the messy parts with sweet songs and cutesy art projects, but our kids are not fooled. If we remain silent, they might conclude either that Christianity has nothing useful to say about violence, or that it is so intertwined with violence that we are silent out of shame. So what's a Christian educator to do? Our first task is to get our own theology straight, because I'm guessing that those of you who avoid discussing biblical violence do so for a very good reason. You haven't found an interpretation that doesn't blame God for it. From the expulsion of Adam and Eve through the cross and on to Judgment Day, God's purposes seem tangled up with God's violence. Sorting that out from Jesus' teaching that God is love, in whom there is no violence at all, has escaped most of our theologies. Using the insights of René Girard's mimetic theory, theologians are providing a fresh reading of Christian doctrine, one that makes sense of biblical violence from an unusual starting point. Sure, the Bible and the cross are violent, but humans are violent too, without any help from God. These theologians point out that if we read the Bible and see evidence of God's violence there, we have things backwards. The more honest story, the one we discover when we read through the eyes of the crucified and risen Christ, is that rather than inflict violence on his Son, God suffers our violence and forgives us for it. So let's search for a story about our violence and God's mercy that we can teach our children in 3 biblical passages. Our first verse is from the Gospel of John. Jesus says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give as the world gives." What often passes our notice is that Jesus is not questioning the goal of peace, which is rarely in dispute, even among warring enemies. Human beings have a rather long and shameful history of killing each other in the name of peace. What should demand our attention is the contrast Jesus drew between 2 different methods to achieve the goal. Our word method comes from the Greek words meta and odos, literally after a way or pursuing a way. Christianity is called the odos, the way in the Acts of the Apostles, which is to say that following Jesus involves us in a gradual but radical shift away from our reliance on the world's way of achieving peace. In our second verse, we hear from Caiaphas, who famously described the world's way. The Gospel of John gives us Caiaphas's message to the ruling council not because his way of thinking was unusual, but because how he wants the council to respond to the rabble-rouser Jesus is normative. In other words, Caiaphas expressed the normal human way of keeping the peace when he said, "You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." But of course we do understand it. Caiaphas is describing the world's way of creating peace by sacrificing and scapegoating victims, the one for the many. If we fail to see ourselves in Caiaphas, we cannot see that his way is our way. Sacrificing the one for the many is the way of all humanity. It is the sin that Jesus died to forgive. Jesus died the death of the scapegoat, guilty and condemned without remorse, but his story reverses the normal scapegoating narrative. This scapegoat's cries of innocence are not drowned out by the mob. Despite all appearances, he is not at their mercy, but instead suffers death at the hands of the crowd in order to offer mercy. The Gospels present us with a minority report that requires us to radically shift our perspective on the guilt of our victims and on our own innocence. The cross of Christ reveals that it is the ones we persecute, demonize, exclude, and kill as enemies who turn out to be Christ among us. To believe that we would not have agreed with Caiaphas, condemned Jesus, and joined the crowd demanding Jesus' crucifixion is to remain enslaved to sin. The third and final verse I offer you is from Luke's Gospel. On the 3rd day, the risen Christ appeared to 2 confused disciples, and Luke tells us that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them all the things in Scriptures concerning himself. Here we find Jesus instructing the disciples how to read Scripture through his eyes. Do you think Jesus left out the violent parts when he was explaining the things concerning himself? Could he have told the story of his crucifixion without the violence? Indeed, he could not. At the cross, Jesus met us at our worst and loved us anyway, and that revelation depends on our willingness to find ourselves in the violent places in Scriptures and our world. We are uncomfortable with biblical violence because Jesus made us so. He taught us how to read Scripture through his eyes, the eyes of a scapegoat. Our Scriptures are sacred because the voice of the victim has not been silenced in them. Sacred stories echo with their protests of innocence and cause us to cringe at how easily we blame God for what we have done. Friends, the Bible is a violent book and the cross is a violent place because we are violent, but we don't have to be. We must teach our children and youth to read through the eyes of the risen Christ, whose living presence continues to reveal our sin to us even as we are forgiven for it. For what do we remember at the communion table if not the story of human violence told from the perspective of the most innocent of all victims? Do this in remembrance of me. Jesus, the forgiving victim, has every reason to condemn us, but offers us mercy instead. To proclaim Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life is to witness to the way of forgiveness, the truth of human violence, and the abundant life that following Jesus makes possible for all people. Fear not, Jesus tells us, for he has conquered the world. Let us boldly share this good news with our children.